Hello, everyone. This is the 92nd episode of the Soccer Nostalgia Talk Podcast. As always, this is Sean from Los Angeles and the Soccer Nostalgia blog, and I am joined by Paul from Shipley in England and the 1888 Letter blog. For this episode, we interview English blogger Mr. Tom Griffiths as we discuss the adventures of Oldham Athletic in the early years of the Premier League era. Mr. Griffith is the administrator of the website Calcio England. Back in March on my blog, I interviewed Mr. Griffiths regarding his site Calcio England. I would also like to point out that both Paul and Tom are lifelong Oldham fans and have followed the trajectory of the team in these last decades. They will both share their memories of those years where for a brief moment Oldham Athletic were part of the elite of English football. It was an adventure that started and ended with two separate FA Cup semi-finals, one in 1990 and the next in 1994, both against Manchester United. Welcome, Tom.
Hi, Shahan. Nice to see you.
Can you start off by introducing yourself for any listener not familiar with Calcio England?
Yeah, of course, no worries. And yeah, as you plugged there, I had an earlier conversation which I would refer people to for the longer version of this. But yeah, it's a website and an associated social media accounts focused on Italian football for an English speaking audience. It's focused pretty much around everything, but particularly the stuff that happens off the field. So the history, the culture, the sort of fan culture, and the things that go with that. So yeah, I write longer form pieces. Enjoy doing my sort of research through the history of the game and try to sort of keep on top of the sort of the current happenings of what's going on in and around Italian football. So yeah.
Let's start off by describing both of your affinities to Oldham Athletic.
Paul, I think you should go first on this one.
Yeah, perhaps we should stick to the chronological order on this one. Yeah, well, it's certainly a bit unusual that you've managed to find two Oldham fans who aren't from Oldham, Sean. So, uh, as you know, I was born and brought up in Leeds, but my dad's from Oldham, and he started taking me there in the early '80s when it was obvious that I was already obsessed with football. And I'd been to a couple of first division games at Elland Road and also at Nottingham Forest. But this was quite a different experience. Only a few thousand people there. You were much closer to the pitch and the players. You could hear a lot of bad language, people smoking on the terraces, quite a lot of space around us. It was very different. And we'd also go and visit family in Oldham before games, so it was quite a nice family experience as well. And yeah, I just really enjoyed going. It's really exciting for me as a kid, and little did we know that it was about to lead to the adventure we're discussing tonight.
I'll give my version of that. Yeah, so Paul, I didn't realise that you weren't from Oldham. So yeah, that is quite an achievement to find two of us. So yeah, my association goes back to I think sort of October 1989, and one particular match when I was a sort of young and impressionable 7-year-old. When Oldham played Scarborough in the League Cup and won 7-0, and Frankie Bunn scored a world record. I'm not sure if you can call it a world record when you're talking about the Littlewoods Cup, but a record 6 goals in one match. And I was hooked. I've described myself in other places as a failed glory hunter because I thought I was onto a winner. And of course, as we'll discover over the course of this conversation, it was very much an upward trajectory over the first few years. So it sort of it got me hooked. And then yeah, it didn't turn out so well in the sort of remaining 25 years between then and now. But yeah, that's it basically. I got sort of hooked on this exciting team that seemed to score a lot of goals, a team which then went on to sort of defy the odds and beat some of the bigger and more established clubs. And yeah, so suffice to say, growing up in the West Midlands, I was the only Oldham Athletic fan around. All my mates were Aston Villa, Man United, Tottenham, all the usual suspects. So yeah, and I think there's something in my psyche as well that sort of likes to favour the underdog as well. So yeah, I think it was sort of a match made in heaven for me and Oldham.
For those who may not be aware, can you briefly describe Oldham Athletic in terms of geography and history up to the late 1980s?
Well, geographically, it's a small town in East Lancashire. She's close to Manchester, but not part of it, but close enough that the club's more or less always been in the shadow of Manchester City and Manchester United, probably more than ever now that you see kids wearing their replica shirts and not really interested in their struggling National League team. But that's always been the case to some extent. And as to the history, the high point before the era that we're talking about today would be before the First World War, when they were quite a power, and that was when they first reached the FA Cup semi-final and also came very close to winning the league in 1915. I believe they failed to pick up a point in the last couple of games, which would have won them the title. They were then relegated in the early 1920s, and to cut a long story short, spent the best part of 70 years drifting around the lower divisions.
I think that's right, and I think it's worth also saying, the sort of fortunes and the trajectory of the town were really quite strongly associated with the sort of industrial development. So I think it was quite regarded as quite a sort of prosperous town, and as the sort of industrial revolution took hold, textiles mills all over the town known as a town of chimneys, and some of those still exist. So I think it was a bit of a boom town in some of those early days, but obviously as that as a lot of that activity sort of declined and went offshore, then the fortunes of Oldham as a place sort of went in the same direction. So it's as you say, a town that sort of lived in the shadow somewhat of Manchester in both sort of footballing terms, but also in kind of prosperity, I think, to a certain degree.
The Oldham Athletic story at the top is linked to the appointment of former Everton star Joe Royle in 1982. It took many years for things to take shape. Can you describe the state of things upon his appointment and the changes that he implemented in the beginning?
Sure, I'll take this to one as we're delving into history that partially remembered, at least, because Joe Royle took over from Jimmy Frizzell, who was a very highly respected manager, had been a player at Oldham and had been manager since 1970. He was the manager who took them into the second division, and they were actually quite a well-established second division club when he was sacked, quite surprisingly, in the summer of 1982, and Joe Royle appointed. And at that point, Joe Royle was completely an untried manager. He just retired as a player. It was his first job. He certainly had very little money to spend. The club was surviving probably on one of the lower budgets in that division, on fairly low crowds. And he basically had to wheel and deal to put a team together with any chance of challenging for promotion. He introduced players like Andy Gorham and came into the team in his first season in charge. And he was also renowned for bringing in experienced players from the bigger clubs around him. And some of those players, Martin Buchan was there briefly, David Fairclough, and probably most importantly, Willie Donachie, who was also his assistant at the time. And the first few seasons weren't too fruitful. They continued pretty much in the same vein as a sort of mid-table second division club. And we may as well mention this early on, but the infamous plastic pitch was installed in 1986. And I think as we go through the seasons, we'll see that it wasn't the only reason for Oldham's success, but it's often mentioned. And really up until the first season they reached the playoffs, finished third the first season that they had the pitch. But then they had a couple of really poor seasons. No one was talking about it as being a big advantage then. And I think when we look at the quality of the players and what a lot of them went on to after leaving Oldham, we can see that we're dealing with a really good side. But and then quite a few memorable wins on grass as well that we'll cover over the course of this.
I think it's worth adding sort of a bit of colour onto that as well. The sort of the marriage between Joe Royle and Oldham was sort of like really well suited in so many ways. Like Joe Royle, I think he was only about 32, 33, had to retire from playing. So he was like desperate for his big break. His livelihood depended on it. As you described, some of the challenges that he didn't have a big transfer budget. He basically needed to make things work on a shoestring, and I think his sort of character, his personality, the network and contacts that he had, and the sort of the esteem with which he was held in the game really helped him. And I think what does become evident is his personality, his ability to bring the best out of a bit of a motley crew of players taken from all sorts of places at different stages in their careers, and really get a tune out of them collectively. That's for me the thing that he did so expertly. And I think as you said, it didn't happen straight away. There was some. I think his second season, we finished near to the bottom of the division, and I think even 4 or 5 seasons in, he had quite a bad season before things really started to click. And if you superimpose that onto the modern game, he wouldn't have lasted that long. He would have been sacked in that second season because the club weren't going in the right direction; they were going in the wrong direction. But it was a different time. He stayed, and we didn't look back.
Let's discuss the transfer activity in the immediate couple of preceding seasons that might have impacted the team prior to the 1990 FA Cup adventure. And I guess the names that come to my mind, like let's say for 88, 89, we have the likes of Ian Marshall coming from Everton, also Paul Warhurst coming from Manchester City.
Yeah, I mean, I'm happy to start on this one. I think it sort of relates to what we were just saying. That Joe Royle's and Willie Donachie's actually eye for talent. So a lot of those players you've just described there were signed from bigger, more established first division clubs. They were young players who hadn't really had their opportunity. But Joe Royle saw enough in them to bring them to the club. Often, initially on loan and then permanently. And I think it got to the point where this was becoming a little bit of an embarrassment, actually, for the likes of Manchester City and Everton. Eventually that they'd passed these players on to us for peanuts. I think Dennis Irwin is probably like one of the best examples. He came from Leeds. That we picked these players up for nothing or nominal transfer fees, and they turned out to be fantastic players who achieved an enormous amount within the game. So it was that eye for the talent and the ability to sort of bring that to the surface, which is something that I think is a really striking feature of that period.
Yeah, absolutely. That was the thing, as you mentioned earlier, the ability to pick up these players. Who, again, if we look at the modern game, no one's going to consider moving from Manchester City or Everton to Oldham. But I think it's often mentioned the wage differentials weren't that huge that it would deter players. It was undoubtedly a little bit of a drop, but I think they saw it as a springboard, which in many cases it proved to be. Another excellent signing from Leeds was Andy Ritchie, and there were a couple of others prior to this who were both sold on, Andy Linnigan and Tommy Wright, and I think that was key to Joe Royle's success as well, especially in the period when there wasn't a lot of money, that he was able to pick up these players, develop them, and they were sold on. Andy Gorham was sold just prior to this as well, and he managed to find John Hallworth and Andy Rhodes, who sort of alternated as goalkeepers in 89-90, who were both excellent goalkeepers. Frank Bunn was another bargain signing. And then there was a handful, Andy Barlow, Nick Henry and Mike Milligan, who'd come through the youth system. So, yeah, it was this ability to blend a team together over a number of seasons that really led to the success that we're going to discuss.
Just to add to that as well, I think if you look at the sort of hallmarks of any team that consistently punches above their weight for any consistent period, it's not just about having like one brilliant team, because of what you've described there, the necessity to sell, introduces this requirement to regenerate and to repeat the trick of finding the rough diamonds, unearthing the next one before you've sold this one, so that you've got that, that's a sort of sustainability and continuity and growth. And that was the trick that Oldham and Joe Royle seemed to keep repeating year upon year, actually, until that point. As we get into it, I think we'll see a bit more of that in action.
Let's look at the squad at the old second division in 1989-90 season. So as first transfers, Neil Adams came from Everton, Rick Holden arrived from Watford, and also in January, Neil Redfern also arrived from Watford. And the team contained the likes of, you mentioned, Holworth and Rhodes in goal, Barlow, Earl Barrett, Willie Donachie, I believe, was he still playing as well as assisting, it seems like?
I think he would still make the occasional appearance, even though he was pushing 40. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. So Dennis Irwin, Andrew Holden, Nick Henry. You mentioned Mike Milligan, Redfern, Ian Thompson, Paul Warhurst, Frank Bunn, Rick Holden, Ian Marshall, Scott McGarvey, Roger Palmer, and Andy Ritchie. The team finished 8th in the league, missing out on the playoffs.
Well, it started off not too promisingly, much like the usual form was being followed. Quite a slow start. And those signings, Neil Adams had been on loan previously. He was one of those players that had impressed on loan and was picked up quite cheaply. Rick Holden at the time, I believe that was the most money that Joe Royle had ever spent on a player. And he was replacing Tommy Wright, who'd gone to Leicester. And he was a very different type of player. Tommy Wright was very, very quick, very direct. And Rick had more or less a unique style, I think it's fair to say, and just proved to be really integral to the success of that team. But it's really the cup runs that obviously we'll discuss in more detail that were the real catalyst, I think, this season. The game that hooked Tom in, very memorable night against Scarborough, and then particularly the following round against Arsenal. I think that would be the single game that I would say changed the trajectory of the whole club, really. That it was very rare for Oldham to be on TV or get any kind of publicity. And Arsenal at the time were the champions and league leaders, and it was a really comprehensive win and performance. And from there, that just seemed to kickstart the season. From then on, they were always chasing the playoffs, really, rather than established. But it was an incredible season, so many memorable games, and national attention on Oldham Athletic, which was completely unheard of. Or maybe it'd been the same in 1914-15, I don't know, but certainly in our lifetimes it was unheard of. And in the end, it was probably too many games for a relatively small squad. It wasn't really possible to rotate them, even if that had been a concept at the time. I think that Earl Barrett might have played in every one of the 65 games that season, and Milligan and Rick Holden and other players played 60 plus games, which is quite incredible. And it was just an amazing season. I think when we cover the cup runs in a bit more detail, we'll see some of the games that really stand out.
Yeah, I think we sort of segued that into sort of 89, 90, as you say. That was sort of the moment where it all started to come together, and Oldham were sort of getting into the sort of national consciousness. But yeah, I mean, a couple of the sort of the themes, and we talked about the transfer business before, but is sort of picking up players like Rick Holden, who, as you say, wasn't a cheap signing. It was an expensive signing by Oldham standards, but he was someone who had a strong reputation, but someone who wasn't perhaps fulfilling his potential at Watford at that point. I think he was maybe a bit homesick, having sort of come from, was it Halifax he came from, to Watford. So again, that is one of the other sort of arts that Royal and Oldham has would be to sort of pluck these players. And Andy Holden, I think he was taken from like Chester City, sort of identifying these players from sort of obscure teams or players who had more potential than perhaps they were showing, and creating an environment where they could contribute and fulfill that potential. So yeah, I think that's again another theme that you start to see in it. I don't know whether it was ever sort of discussed within the club as sort of like an intentional sort of strategy here about sort of picking up those kinds of players, but it did seem to be a sort of recurring feature of what happened there. The only other person I mentioned in that era as well, I think is worthy is of special mention is Andy Barley, local lad who's a sort of multi-talented sportsman. I loved him when I was a kid because I was a left back, not a very good one, but he was Oldham's left back, and like I don't know, he felt like Mr. Oldham Athletic, incredibly reliable traditional left fullback who sort of represented the club and the town.
I'd second that, and also on the theme of players that didn't quite fit in. I think Rick Holden has quoted Joe Royle as saying, "You're all here because there's something wrong with you," which I guess was his way of motivating and bringing them together as a group.
Let's look at the 1990 FA Cup run first. That culminated with the defeat against Manchester United at the semi-final stage. A replay was required to defeat Birmingham. That followed a win against Brighton. It took 2 replays against Everton. This was the first division side that they met in their run. Then in the quarterfinals, they met Aston Villa, who finished runners-up that season in the first division. And this was the Aston Villa of David Platt, managed by Graham Taylor. And finally, it reached a semi-final, meeting Manchester United. Again, it required a replay. The first match ended as a 3-3 tie, and they lost the replay 2-1.
I mean, this was, I say, that I was sort of in the kind of honeymoon period in my sort of support of Oldham Athletic at this point. So I was lapping this up as they were defeating teams like Aston Villa. As I said earlier, I had a few mates who supported Villa, so like this was incredible stuff, and sort of really justified why I supported this team. But yeah, it was kind of fairy tale stuff, and I think a sort of strange expectation that Oldham could actually just do this, right? It wasn't just a sort of, hopefully we can sort of grind, go away somewhere, grind out a goal, or bring them back to Boundary Park. It was sort of going toe to toe with some of the biggest clubs in the country. You mentioned Villa were, I think, finished second that season. Like Everton were, not many seasons on from having won the title themselves, and probably a top 5 team in that regard. It all came to a bit of a head in my household at the semi-final stage. So my dad and my brother were Man United fans, so I remember us pretty much exchanging blows that afternoon in the 3-3 draw as we sat on the settee watching the game, and as the sort of pendulum swung between the two teams, it was high drama, high excitement, and if you if you watch back that game, there were like it was just such an open end-to-end game. There were so many points at which either team could have like killed that game off. Incredible stuff, obviously, and as it was, an Oldham lad, Mark Robbins, broke our hearts in the replay, and that was that.
Yeah, these games bring back amazing memories, really. To think, as Tom says, that Oldham were going toe to toe with some of the biggest teams in the country. I went to all of the home games in this run and the semi-final replay. The 3 games against Everton were a real battle, very, very physical, and right in the middle of the League Cup run as well. It was, every few days there was another huge game coming up, and as Tom said, Villa were having a really good season, and they were really just blown away in that game. And Graham Taylor was actually very fair and credited Oldham, didn't attempt to blame the pitch. The Manchester United game, the first game, absolute classic semi-final, following on from Crystal Palace Liverpool earlier that day, which also, to be honest, was a little bit of an extra incentive because Crystal Palace felt like they might have been a beatable team at that time. And I think both games were really well contested. There's a very poor decision in the replay, which is rarely mentioned these days. Nick Henry's shot that hit the bar. Maybe with VAR, that could have been a different outcome. It certainly looked like it was in from the other end of the pitch, anyway, from where I was stood. But
from a mere 100 yards away, it looked definitely,
definitely very clearly. But it was incredibly disappointing to lose the replay, but it certainly showed everyone that Oldham could play on grass and the quality of the players. Alex Ferguson was also very gracious afterwards. I think he said that Oldham were the best side that they'd faced that season, and that really established their reputation, I think, as being a team that was of genuine quality and not just reliant on their pitch.
Also, in the same season, Oldham Athletic reached the final of the League Cup, losing to Nottingham Forest 1-0. And this run included a home and away win against Leeds, the match against Scarborough that you mentioned, the 7-0, with defeating Arsenal, who were the defending league champions. Then a replay against Southampton, and a 6-0 win against West Ham, followed by a 3-0 loss in the semi-finals before losing to Brian Clough's Nottingham Forest in the final. This FA Cup run and the League Cup run were running concurrently. So as you mentioned, the press attention increased due to these runs as well.
Yeah, and bearing in mind with all this that they had an absolutely terrible cup record for many years and were generally out with both cups by early January. This was totally unprecedented. And again, there's so many memorable games in there. For the same reasons as Tom, I enjoyed the wins against Leeds, surrounded by Leeds fans. Frank Bunn's record, which I believe still stands in the League Cup. Arsenal, I still think that was the catalyst for all of that, and that was a really outstanding performance. Southampton, that was another really dramatic game. Andy Ritchie equalising in the last minute at the Dell, beating them at Boundary Park, and then West Ham. Again, one of those performances where they were just irresistible at home. Teams did fear the pitch. It seemed to affect them psychologically, but Oldham were just relentless in that game. That was an incredible win, and the real shame in this season, I think, even by Brian Clough's admission, that final just came a little bit too late for Oldham. It was again, they gave a good account of themselves, more or less matched Forest, but they just didn't quite have the same energy that I think we'd seen throughout the season. It was a very hot day, I remember. It's the last time I ever went to Wembley. I didn't go to the 94 semi-final. And they just weren't quite at their best. But it was still, a day out at Wembley for Oldham Athletic was an incredible achievement.
Yeah, I did just reflecting on that semi-final against West Ham. I mean, just the idea of winning a first leg 6-0 is just, it's just incarnate. Yeah, you just can't really sort of grasp it. That only really happens when Man City play Red Bull Salzburg or something, in the Champions League, and it's a bit of a miss. Like 6-0, it's just such a sort of crazy way to stay. It was on the 14th of February, and it's known as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, and very fondly remembered. I recently bought from eBay the negative of a very famous photo of Rick Holden, because celebrating victory in that game in a white shirt that I think had been like specially commissioned, because Oldham's red and blue shirts clashed with West Ham. So I mean, just incredible. As you say, it all just got a bit much. I've got the season record here in front of me, and I've just looked at it. It was that period in March and April where the League Cup and the FA Cup was coming thick and fast, and that's when the league form dropped off and really suffered. And then if you look from, I think it says here 29th of April was the League Cup final against Forest. From there, they played on May the 1st in the league, May the 3rd in the league, May the 5th in the league, May the 7th in the league. So that I don't think modern day managers would be too happy with that kind of schedule. Funnily enough, Oldham actually did pretty well in the league after they'd got all the cup stuff out of the way, but it was that sort of congestion in the sort of March, April period where they were like juggling three things, both cups and the league, which just seemed to be our undoing in the end. So we came out of it empty-handed, but yeah, we had some great memories, and obviously the club used it as a bit of a springboard for the following season.
Indeed, Oldham and Royal used these cup runs as a springboard, like you mentioned. At that point, did you feel Oldham were on the verge of promotion in a couple of seasons?
I don't. Yeah, I think I probably did. It wasn't a very informed view when I was 7 or 8 years old, but eternal optimist. I always think we're going to get promoted at the start of every season, and then it takes usually a few weeks for me to dampen that enthusiasm. But yeah, I mean, there was absolutely no reason not to think that they would continue that role. We did lose a couple of players after that season, a couple of key players. So I think that was the point. You correct me if I'm not right here, Paul, but I think that was the point at which Irwin left Man United. That was also the point at which Milligan left for Everton. So like those were, out of our starting 11, those were two pretty big characters, big players. We didn't actually recruit massively that summer. Oh well, I think sort of with the benefit of retrospect, we didn't sign significant players who really added an enormous amount to our promotion push. We did shell out quite a bit of money on players, but those things generally didn't work out actually that well. So it was the core of that squad, minus actually a couple of the really key players that took us forward.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, Irwin had been there, I think, 4 seasons maybe, and was obviously destined for greater things. It was a disappointment that he moved on, but really, to have 4 good seasons of a player of that quality was, again, he wouldn't be hanging around for 4 seasons now. And Milligan, who was a player I remember, virtually from the start of his Oldham career, he was one of those players who doesn't always get a lot of attention, did a lot of the ugly things in midfield, stopping the opposition, but full of energy. Captain, real leader of the team. So yeah, it was. There were no direct replacements signed for them and the team was reshuffled a little bit. But I think everyone was quite confident after the previous season that, barring injuries, unexpected loss of form, that they were, I think there was a really big focus on promotion that season. It wasn't shied away from. I think Joe Royle was talking about it from the end of the previous season, that would be the main goal, the only goal really of the following year. And I think people were pretty confident that this time it wasn't misplaced.
Let's look at the promotion season at the old second division in 1991 season. So you mentioned Dennis Irwin left and Mike Milligan also left to join Everton. Also, Scott McGarvey left. The players who came in, you have John Keeley, goalkeeper from Brighton, a striker, David Curry from Nottingham Forest, Richard Jobson arrived from Hull City. Later in the season, Paul Molden came from Bournemouth. Paul Kane came from Hibs. And in February, the Norwegian defender, Gunnar Hall, came from Lillestrøm. So you still have the likes of Holworth in goal. Earl Barrett stood at that season and would be capped at the end of that season. Andrew Holden, Neil Adams, Scottish midfielder Paul Bernard, Nick Henry, Neil Redfern, Paul Warhurst, Rick Holden, Ian Marshall, and Andy Ritchie and Roger Palmer. This was the memorable season for Oldham. They finished at the top and earned their way to the first division.
I mean, my relationship with the team was sort of lived out through three main means. One was like the daily newspaper. The other was Shoot magazine, weekly magazine for kids, which Oldham were featured in quite a lot actually, because they were nation's sweetheart and quite an exciting sort of proposition. And the third leg of that was teletext. Do you know what I mean by that, Shahad? Do they have that in the States, or did they have it?
Teletext? No, I don't know what that is.
It's like the sort of precursor to the internet, where you used to get the text up on the television. And that's basically how you followed the scores as the games were unfolding. You used to go into this sort of like text mode and type in a page number, and it would just like flick through the score. So I would routinely sit there for 90 minutes with these pages just ticking around. And so that was kind of it's like it was incredibly exciting at the time, because I was supporting this team where there was a realistic expectation that each week they might get a result, that they might, they could well win that game. And I remember being so bitterly disappointed whenever they lost, which wasn't that often, thankfully, but because it was, it did have this feel of, this is a team who, are winning games, can win games, and have real potential here. Like my sort of sweethearts were Andy Ritchie in particular. Absolutely loved him. He sort of had the appearance of a sort of 45-year-old man, but was only actually about 30 at that point. But he always seemed to come up with a goal when we needed it. We had people like Ian Marshall, who he could alternate between centre back and centre forward. And Paul might have sort of first-hand memories of this, but I understand that sort of Joe Royle's like quite gung-ho attacking style. He would midway through the match, switch Ian Marshall from centre back to centre forward to go and get a goal, or to sort of send us into some kind of unassailable lead. And it was that like mentality of like outscoring your opponents, and that is a incredibly exciting way to play football. Pretty precarious and gung-ho, and quite a long way from the sort of very sort of intellectual, tactical football that you see in the Premier League these days. But entertainment factor 10 out of 10, absolutely. And I won't describe the finale in the last day of the season. I could pull something to talk about there, but yeah, I mean, in my earlier comments, the one person who I overlooked in terms of one signing who did make an enormous contribution, Richard Jobson, of course, like at centre back, he was tremendous and continued to be tremendous when we did ultimately get promoted at centre back. And you mentioned Paul Bernard. which is a bit of a trailer for that last day of the season. But he was a young Scottish player who came through the youth team basically, and forced his way into the side towards the end of the season. And it was a similar story for Gunnar Haller as well. Actually, as I say, joined sort of February, March time, but sort of turned out to be a really valuable addition, but whose true value probably only became sort of understandable in later seasons when he really established himself as an Oldham player.
Yeah, there was a bit more money around this season after the cup runs, certainly by Oldham standards. And I think, if I'm right, each of those signings that you mentioned, each one was a club record at the time. They broke the club record signing 3 times in the season. Unfortunately, John Keeley and David Curry. We don't need to linger too long on them, but absolutely Richard Jobson, I think, was the key signing. He was a class act from the start. I remember seeing his debut, and it was obvious that they'd signed a real top quality player. The defence was much more solid with him and Earl Barrett at the heart of it. The team was just totally focused this season. Won 5 in a row at the start of the season, unbeaten in 16, I think, and just never lost that momentum. No cup distractions. Exciting as the cups were, undoubtedly they played a big part in not reaching the playoffs the previous season. And I think this was also a testament to their reputation. Now I was actually finding that some of my friends were interested in going, people that had previously been a little bit dismissive, suddenly wanted to go to games. And I remember travelling to Barnsley and Hull and Sheffield Wednesday on my own as a 17-year-old. I think I would have been 17 at the time, and occasionally friends coming along to home and away games. And yeah, it was, in retrospect, seeing Oldham dominating a division and expecting them to win, if anything, maybe made me become a little bit blasé about it, that suddenly there was an expectation that they were going to win. But yeah, the abiding memory of this season is the last game against Sheffield Wednesday, neck and neck with West Ham to actually, they'd already been promoted at this stage, but this was to win the league. Sheffield Wednesday were also already promoted, managed by Ron Atkinson. Excellent team. John Sheridan at the heart of their midfield, David Hurst scoring a lot of goals up front, and it was a capacity crowd for the last game of the season. And Sheffield Wednesday dominated probably the first hour of this game, 2-0 up. Oldham needed to win to win the title. Ian Marshall scored, I think, after about an hour, and then Paul Bernard, as Tom mentioned, he'd only maybe this was his second game. He'd certainly only just come into the team. Young player, he scored to equalise, and then the last 10 minutes was just Oldham laying siege to the Sheffield Wednesday goal. All sorts of penalty appeals. Viv Anderson was actually playing for Sheffield Wednesday as a central defender at that time. And in the last minute, there was a massive appeal for handball against Viv Anderson. And the ball went loose to Tom's favourite, Andy Barlow, made one of his surging runs forward and fell over John Sheridan's leg for a penalty in the dying seconds. At this point, apparently West Ham were already celebrating on the pitch that they'd won the title. And Neil Redfern stepped up for, I think, what's been described as the most important kick in Oldham's history. Maybe arguable, but if you were there, it was certainly the most exciting, which he put away without any apparent nerves at all. Huge pitch invasion, final whistle went, and Oldham had won something in our lifetimes, and won it in real style as well. It was an incredible end to the season. That was the last time that the big home end, the Chadderton Road end, was terraced. That was the last time to stand on that terrace, which I did with my dad. And again, I enjoyed it hugely at the time, but maybe if I'd known what I know now, I would have savoured it even more at the time. But yeah, it's an incredible memory that topped off one of the seasons ever.
In retrospect, this season was perhaps the zenith of the Oldham adventure.
In terms of achievement and winning games, dominating teams more often than not. Really well balanced team, strong squad. The additions we've mentioned, they actually had a lot more depth than the previous season. Joe Royle was able to change it around when needed and bring players in and freshen up the team, which would have been invaluable in 89-90. And yeah, I think we'd have to say this was the high point.
It is a bit like choosing a favourite child, though. They were all great.
Yeah, it's true. It's true.
Let's look at the first season back in what was to become the last season of the old First Division, 1991-92. Mike Milligan returned from Everton after one season. Brian Kilcline was signed from Coventry, but then he would leave in the middle of the season in February, I believe. Craig Fleming arrived from Halifax Town. Graham Sharp, the Scottish striker, arrived from Everton. And Glyn Snowden also arrived on loan from Leeds. Also, once the season started in October, Neil MacDonald arrived from Everton. And towards the end of the season in March, Neil Tolson from Walsall. The players that left included Neil Redfern and David Curry, who joined Barnsley. Paul Warhurst joined Sheffield Wednesday. Paul Kane left in November to join Aberdeen. Ian Thompson left in January to join Exeter City. We mentioned Brian Kilcline left in February to join Newcastle. And most importantly, Earl Barrett left in February to join Aston Villa. The team finished 17th out of 22 and maintained survival status. How was that looked upon at the time, the first season back?
I think from my perspective, I think I probably didn't have the sort of required perspective. I mean, this sounds crazy to say it, but I was probably a bit disappointed in some ways, right? So my memories were beating Aston Villa, beating Arsenal, in that famous cup run. We just won the league, and I don't think I really quite had a grasp of how different it would be playing those teams every single week. Maybe we can come back to the loss of the plastic pitch as well, which was one aspect of it. But they finished 17th. It was a sort of comfortable survival. We took a few notable scalps along the way, but I don't know if you'd have asked me back then how I felt about it, I probably would have said, a bit disappointed. Might have been hoping for mid-table or pushing on for Europe, but again, looking back, I think I've probably got a bit more measure on. That's a pretty sound accomplishment actually to sort of consolidate in that first season back.
I would actually echo that. I was a little bit disappointed, bizarre as it sounds, as a supporter of a team that's just finished mid-table in the National League. But I think they were never in real danger of relegation. They lost heavily to Manchester City on the last day of the season. I think if they'd won that, they would have been more or less mid-table in the first division. There were some really good wins. They did win at Manchester City, demolished Chelsea in the first home game. That was particularly memorable. beat Leeds United in Eric Cantona's first game in England. But I was also a little bit disappointed with the transfer activity as well. I really liked Paul Warhurst and Neil Redfern, and they both left really after a dispute with Joe Royle about their best position, and no one was prepared to compromise. And it's a real shame that those players left. It wasn't, I don't think that they were desperate to leave, or that the club was getting huge offers for them. At that point, they weren't really under pressure to sell. But the one that still haven't really got over was Earl Barrett, because he was such a great player at the heart of the team that had won the second division the season before. And the really strange thing is he'd obviously got himself at least onto the fringes of the England team as a centre half, and hardly ever played there again for his other clubs. Ron Atkinson bought him for Villa and played him at fullback, and then I think that's where he played for Everton later on, when he was one of the best central defenders in the country, which it seemed really strange. But fortunately, Craig Fleming was another of those signings that Joe Royle had picked up for next to nothing from the lower divisions. He was a really strong, aggressive defender. He was, went on to again be an excellent player for Oldham for many seasons. But I think the loss of Redfern, who'd scored a lot of goals the previous season, it just took a dimension away from the team. I think Milligan, everyone knew exactly his game, and he was excellent at it. But him and Nick Henry performed a very similar role in the middle of midfield, and Redfern just had a little bit more creativity. He was a bit more of an attacking player. And the other signings, Brian Kilcline, I think we could say was maybe past his best. Graham Sharp was a strange one. He had such a great pedigree, but he was more of a hold-up player to me. Never really fitted into the style that we'd become accustomed to at Oldham. And it also meant then that Ian Marshall was kind of competing with him a little bit, and then later on moved back into defence, and then that was the source of another dispute later on. I think there were just a few cracks in Joe Royle's management appearing, with the falling out with players, and some of the transfers when he had a little bit more money to play with. Neil MacDonald was another one that that was $500,000, which was a lot for Oldham at the time, and he didn't make a big impression, if I'm being polite. But they still scored a lot of goals and proved that they could play at the top level on grass. And I think the recruitment was key. I think if we then are looking at that summer before the Premier League, I think they were at a point where they'd survived fairly comfortably, and maybe with the right recruitment, they could have been looking at establishing themselves, like maybe teams like Coventry and Southampton, some of the smaller teams had managed to establish themselves as top division teams. But, well, we'll pick up the story with the Premier League.
Yeah, it's a good reflection, isn't it? That suddenly with a little bit more money at their disposal, and it sort of happened in the signings in 1990, 91, but also 91, 92. It wasn't spent tremendously well. Of those 91, 92 times, Craig Fleming was probably the best, and one of the cheapest, and the one who had the most and sort of longest, most impact and longest legacy at Oldham. The Milligan deal was a good one. Didn't we sell him for $1 million? We got promoted the season he was away and bought him back for a little more than half of what we sold him for. So that's good business in anyone's book. But aside from, as you say, the kind of money we spent on a sort of an aging Graham Sharp, McDonald, didn't look like, in retrospect, didn't look like fantastic pieces of business. I was also totally gutted with Redfern's departure. For me, he was godlike, having scored that penalty. He was very much on a pedestal in my mind. Had I think been almost ever present in the promotion season. So I just remember, it was sort of like an early sort of childhood encounter with grief. I think when I heard that he had been sold. So it was like, how can we possibly conceive of doing that with such a crucial player who scored so many goals for us and played such an important role in getting us here, and it was, as you say, it wasn't an enormous fee. And again, that really grated with me for several years, actually, after he went on to achieve some quite impressive things with Barnsley, Charlton, Bradford. Did he play in the Premier League with all of those?
He did.
He was obviously a player of enormous capability, but as you say, it felt like he left too early.
Definitely, yeah, and it was a source of a lot of complaint as well from the fans. You'd still hear it several years later, people complaining about selling Redfern in particular. I think Barrett was the money, that was the record sale, still is, for 1.7 million, which obviously sounds like peanuts now, but it was a lot of money at the time. You could understand that one a little bit more, but yeah, Redfern still regarded as a big loss.
Let's look at the inaugural Premier League season, 1992-93. As far as transfers, Rick Holden left to join Manchester City and Paul Molden joined Brighton. The arrivals included Steve Redmond from Manchester City, Ian Olney from Aston Villa, Neil Poynton from Manchester City. In November, Mark Brennan joined from Manchester City as well. Paul Molden actually came back in January. So I presume he was loaned for this period. Darren Beckford joined in February from Norwich. And this transfer, I have no memory of this. Maybe you might remember Dutchman Orfeo Kaiser Weird in March. Do you remember him?
I remember the name. It's a memorable name. He played half a game against Liverpool. That was his only first team appearance.
He's a bit of a cult figure, isn't he? His name crops up on sort of message boards and things randomly. His legacy sort of outweighed his impact, really, for no particular reason.
So that season, Oldham just avoided relegation, and they finished 19th. And the teams that were relegated were Crystal Palace, Middlesbrough, and Nottingham Forest. And in fact, they just avoided relegation by goal difference, it seems like. Obviously, the Premier League isn't what it is today. But was it becoming self-evident that Oldham perhaps could not financially survive in this new Premier League?
I wouldn't have. I mean, Oldham were always one of the smaller teams, surviving on smaller attendances and had sort of more limited sort of revenue streams. But I don't think it was really apparent at that stage the impact that the formation of the Premier League and television money would really have. I certainly wouldn't have predicted that our game would be run by sort of American and Saudi billionaires if you'd have asked me back then. But yeah, I mean it was kind of more of the same, really. I think that we were always a bit of an underdog size wise and in our ability to compete. I say there was a bit more money around. We broke the transfer record again with Ian Olney. It was quite a well regarded player. I think England had been an England under 21 international, and he was still quite young when we signed him. I mean, that didn't work out particularly well. He scored a few goals, but not long afterwards got injured and was never quite the same again. We were spending, I remember the double transfer deal for Poynton and Redmond from Man City. I think we paid in excess of £1 million for the pair of them. Again, like certainly Steve Redmond had been a back in England under 21, I think, and he'd been at the heart of Man City's defence for several years. I think there was sort of some surprise because he was still quite young that Man City had let him go relatively cheaply. But I think so we were starting to spend money more so than we had done before in order to compete. I think as if you look as the season goes on as well, though, we're starting to bring through some young players. So Paul Gerrard, the goalkeeper, who ended up at Everton, he became an England under 21 international despite his dodgy knees. He broke into the team and started challenging Hallworth about midway through that season, and I think that was the breakthrough season for Chris Makin as well. Quite a talented fullback who ended up at Marseille, I believe. Yes. He was an early Bosman departure to the south of France, but I don't think it was didn't necessarily feel like a sort of a really critical moment in back then as it probably does when we look back on it now. But what do you think, Paul?
Yeah, again, Rick Holden was another favourite, and I think that was a mistake letting him go. And I'm still not convinced that the two defenders actually improved the team, in my opinion, and it ended up displacing Andy Barlow, which was a shame. Rick Holden, I think, I'm not sure if the Opta statistics were operating at this point, but he would certainly have been very high up, Rick Holden, in the first division assists for the previous season. He put in so many crosses during a game. Mark Brennan, who eventually replaced him, wanted to play more centrally. He was not the same sort of player, played a lot deeper. And I think these signings were sort of an indication that the kind of freewheeling days were coming to an end, and Joe Royle was looking at having a more solid shape to the team, but it didn't really fit the players he had available. And I'm not sure it's so much at that point anyway that they weren't able to compete financially. Of course, they weren't able to spend as much, but as I think Tom and I are probably in agreement more or less that the money they did have wasn't always spent as well as it could have been. And this season was a struggle, and it was redeemed by the dramatic ending of the 3 wins in a week: Aston Villa, Liverpool, and then Southampton, despite a Le Tissier hat-trick on the last game of the season. There's another dramatic ending, but certainly not as memorable overall or satisfying as the previous seasons. I think reality was starting to kick in at this point.
Yeah, I mean, there was some that sort of season seemed quite stop-start. I think there were, we would sort of go winless without, for sort of 3, 4, 5 games sometimes, but then we'd pull out a good result, and it was keeping our nose just above the water for much of the season. And as you say, one game that sticks in my mind was I think a 2-2 draw against Leeds, where I believe we were 2-0 down. Watched the first half in the pub with my dad because it was on Sky, and they were 2-0 down. At halftime, he said, "Come on, let's go home." And obviously, by the time we got home and checked on teletext, it was 2-2, and I'd missed a thrilling second half. I don't think I ever forgave him for that. But it came down to those last three games. Basically needed to win them. Beat Aston Villa, which again I was very pleased about for reasons of the in the playground, which I think unfortunately handed Man United the title, that victory, because Villa were their nearest competitors. I think Neil Poynton scored directly from a corner as we beat Liverpool 3-2 at home. I remember this all from the VHS that I watched to oblivion, basically, and then the drama of the last day match, winning 4-3 at home to Southampton on a pitch. Yeah, there were probably more goals in that game than there were blades of grass on that pitch. It was pretty threadbare at that point in the season, and we were behind, I think, a couple of times in that game before before pulling it back. So yeah, great memories.
Yeah, and we should mention a win over Manchester United this season as well, battling 1-0 win. We don't get to say that very often, or indeed ever. So we've got to mention that.
Let's look at the 1993-94 season and ultimate relegation. For this season, the transfers included Sean McCarthy, arrived from Bradford City. Rick Holden returned in October from Manchester City. Also, Norwegian defender Tori Peterson arrived from Brann. The players that left included Ian Marshall, who would join Ipswich. The aforementioned Orfeo Kaiserweird joined Den Bosch back home. Andy Barlow joined Bradford City. Neil Adams left in February, and also Neil Tolson in December. He left to join Bradford City. This was a season where finally Oldham were relegated. They finished 21st out of 22 teams, just above Swindon, and they only got 40 points that season.
I'll let you start on this one, Paul.
Yeah, this got off to a terrible start this season, and this was the selling of Ian Marshall, which was another really big blow. Player who'd been key for several years, and again, it was an argument about whether he was a centre forward or a central defender. Joe Royle wanted him to play as a defender, and so he was sold to Ipswich. I think his record at Ipswich and then Leicester says that he was a top level striker. So I think, unfortunately, it was another one that Joe Royle got wrong. And of course, the first game of the season was Ipswich at Boundary Park. Marshall scores, and he didn't observe the not celebrating against your former club, put it that way. I think he did more or less a circuit of the ground in celebration, and you couldn't really blame him. And that really set the tone for a season that was going to be a struggle, and for the first time a struggle for goals as well. Even the previous season, they'd actually scored quite a lot. Bringing Rick Holden back was a positive. Added creativity to the team, but it was a struggle. As Tom mentioned, Ian Olney was now injured and never to play again, actually. And we should also mention Frank Bunn didn't ever play in the top division, having been a big part of the team that got promoted. Sean McCarthy, he was an effective lower division striker and scored a great goal at Old Trafford actually this season, but didn't really score the goals that were needed or expected. And then we'll obviously discuss the FA Cup run in a bit more detail, but that ultimately proved to be the downfall really, and they were left with another of those weeks. This time it was 4 games in a week. The previous season they'd won the 3 in a week at the end of the season to stay up, and this time the 4 games on what was then a really, really poor pitch. I think for all the complaints about the plastic pitch, it should also be said that the pitch, both before and after then, has been usually terrible. The ground's very high up and exposed to biting winds and rain, which I've stood in many times, and it tends to result in a terrible pitch. And this season, the pitch was as poor as the team for much of the time. And yeah, I remember the last week they still had a chance of staying up and played home games on the Tuesday and the Thursday, which I went to both of those. I think it was Sheffield United, who they drew with, and then Spurs, who they lost to. And that was really, I think there was still a mathematical chance of staying up on the last game of the season, but it depended on very unlikely set of results, which didn't happen, and they just run out of steam really. That some of the recruitment and the transfer dealings hadn't really worked out in the last couple of seasons. The end of an era really in many ways, and that last game would also have been the last time that I stood on the terraces, because the following year Boundary Park became all-seater. But again, at the time, there's always hope that there'll be an immediate return, and the gulf wasn't so apparent that money would be decisive. Joe Royle was still there, so there was still. It wasn't a complete disaster, and it wasn't completely unexpected either, I think, after the previous season.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with that. I think they'd done the same trick with Holden as they'd had with Milligan. They basically bought him back for less than they'd sold him for, and he was sort of still much the same player. So they'd sort of mastered that sort of maneuver in the transfer market. But yeah, they spent quite a bit of money on Sean McCarthy. As you say, he was I think you probably describe him as a beefcake centre forward. He like thick set and good goal scoring record, but not in the top division. So it was a bit of a gamble. I think he was having a tremendous season for Bradford, or had a tremendous start to the season, Bradford, and we signed him for about $500,000. He scored some goals, but not enough to keep us up. And probably most memorable for was it a somersault goal celebration? Was that McCarthy's trademark? Which not sure how the physics of that work, because he was quite a stocky lad. But yeah, I think if you look towards I say never really got going. A real dearth of goals throughout the season. We'll talk about the FA Cup in a moment, but like that, the reflection is often that is the thing that just sort of the ultimate defeat in the FA Cup in April time was the thing that just sapped all of the momentum out of the team. So I think we ended up playing Man United 3 times in succession in the league, and then twice in the cup. Didn't win any of those games, although as we'll find out, it came very close. And then there were basically 7 league games left after that, and we didn't win a single one of them. So that sort of spirit crushing exit from the FA Cup basically just set the tone for the remainder of the season. My memory of the last day of the season, again, not having the sort of wisdom that I do now, knowing that we'd accomplished the great escape the season before, I was probably quite bullish actually about us pulling it off, that mathematical possibility on the last day. And I think at one point we went 1-0 up in our last game, Sean McCarthy, no less, and Everton, who were one of our rivals, had gone 2-0 down at home to Wimbledon. So I think there might even have been a point at some point after 3:00 on that day where we were out of the relegation zone. But yeah, Everton came back and scored 3 goals to win 3-2. Norwich equalised in our game, and without sounding like a conspiracy theorist, Hans Sagers was in goal for Wimbledon that day against Everton, and he played a part in their collapse. And I think that specific game was kind of part of the evidence that was used in the trial. I think he was found guilty of match fixing and bribery, accepting bribes. I think that's right. Hopefully not saying anything too libelous there, but that always grated a little bit. That's that sort of question of, well, if there was sort of guilt there, may I think I was probably clutching at straws, to be honest. But that didn't sit entirely easily with me. A young me looking out in the world and feeling this sense of unfairness.
The only bright spot of the season was another good FA Cup run that you mentioned. Once again, stopped at the semi-final stage against an even stronger Manchester United. And the team was undone by the brilliance of Andrei Kanchelskis. So this run included wins over Derby County, a replay against Stoke City, wins against Barnsley, Bolton, and the semi-final replay against Manchester United. And of course, the first match is remembered for the last-minute Mark Hughes volley late in the game that led to replay. And of course, in the replay, Manchester United were just stronger, and they ran out 4-1 winners. and eventually won the double that season. How was this FA Cup run compared to the 1991? My guess would be the 1991, there was a feeling of ascendancy, while this one was blighted by the relegation fight and all that.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely didn't have the glamour. If you look at the teams that we beat, as I say, Derby, Stoke, Barnsley, Bolton. I'm not sure any of those were top flight. Were they? So we'd basically had quite an easy route, comparatively speaking, as a Premier League team, and we sort of eked out 1-0 wins in quite a few of those games. It was didn't have the swagger of 89-90 for sure. And yeah, the first semi-final game, obviously at Wembley. I don't know if that was the first time the semi-finals have been held there, but that was a big occasion. There was very much that sense that if we were going to beat Man United, it had to be that day at Wembley. I think Kanchelskis was injured in that game. They had one or two other absentees or suspensions, and it was it was today or not at all. And Neil Poynton with his mullet nudged us in front, and hearts broken by the man whose name we can't mention with 90 seconds on the clock. And as you said, basically our season was very much downhill from that moment. The moment that ball hit the net, nothing quite went right.
Yeah, you very well, Tom. I just needed a minute to compose myself on the memory of that particular goal. Yeah, I mean, you could say that started the downward spiral. And yeah, also as you mentioned, from the results and the score lines, you can see it wasn't the free scoring team of 1990. They were grinding out those wins. I think particularly the one at Bolton. And the semi-final, as you say, there was one opportunity to win that, and again, rather like 1990, ridiculous as it sounds now, but Chelsea were waiting in the final. They weren't the team they are now. Oldham actually had a pretty good record against them. There would have been some. I think I would have probably fancied us in the final had we got there, but I mean, apart from the goal that we needn't mention again, there was the chance that Graham Sharp missed just before that, which was very good chance that would have basically put the game to bed. And the replay, I think you had to find a very optimistic Oldham fan to think that they would have pulled that off. I think it wasn't like 1990 where we felt that we were capable of matching them over two games. I think by then, I think Keane might have been missing from the first game as well, and he announced himself in the replay by taking out Neil Poynton at the knee, for which he was booked. But I mean, Poynton got straight back up. If you see that, that's also quite remarkable. There's absolutely what is a really bad tackle. There's absolutely no attempt to make the most of it or get players sent off. And Kanchelskis had done that also. In fact, probably every time he played against Oldham. But I remember a game in the first season in the Premier League where he was absolutely unstoppable. And he was in this game as well. And unfortunately, we know what happened after that. It seemed to kill the season. They just didn't seem able to recover from that. And it didn't have the whole run. Didn't have the excitement, and there was also the feeling this time that it was going to be draining them for the battle to stay in the Premier League as well, which obviously wouldn't have mattered had they gone through to the final, beaten Chelsea, and started a European dynasty, which will continue to this day. So it wasn't to be.
Let's look at this Oldham adventure as a whole. Who would you consider to be the most emblematic players?
I'll let you have first go at this one, Paul. I find it hard to choose.
Okay, yes, yeah, we've mentioned many of them, but actually we've managed to omit club legend Roger Palmer up to this point, record goal scorer, and he'd actually been signed by Jimmy Frizzell, Joe Royle's predecessor, in 1980. He already seemed to be a fixture when I started going, and he was still there throughout these years. Could also always be relied on for a vital goal. Fantastic servant to the club, very well liked, very modest man, I believe, and yeah, held in the highest regard by Oldham fans. But was coming towards the end of his career in this period, and as you've also mentioned, Tom, Andy Ritchie for me really stands out as probably the outstanding player of this period. Just fantastic striker, very skilled, great finisher. Again, was probably coming towards the end of his career and didn't feature as much in the top division. Had a lot of injuries towards that time. Many of the players we've mentioned, Earl Barrett, Mike Milligan, Ian Marshall, Haller, Neil Adams, John Hallworth, Nick Henry, who again we haven't mentioned hardly at all, and like Milligan did that very effective job in midfield, but didn't really get the headlines, breaking up play. Irwin and Warhurst were both top level players, and obviously going to be so when they were at Oldham. Richard Jobson, another player I really enjoyed watching, real class player. And Neil Adams made a great contribution. Really, we were spoiled with the quality of player that we were watching in those days. And some of the players who maybe didn't feature as much or for as long as they should have done, Rick Holden, Neil Redfern. Yeah, they're all players that we'd love to see turning out for Oldham now.
Yeah, I mean, you've covered pretty much all bases there, which is good. Give me a few prompts. I mean, for me, if I had to pick one, it would be Andy Ritchie, because I think he would, from my perspective, he was there for all of that crucial period and like an active participant, and afterwards, actually, the following season when we were down in the sort of championship level, he scored. He had a bit of a resurgence down there. He managed to stay fit and continue scoring goals well into his 30s. So he was always a bit of an icon for me. But I mean, of those players that you've described, the vast majority of those who left the club ended up having prolonged careers or extending their careers in the top flight. So, Milligan left again, didn't he? And went to Norwich. Adams, the same. Jobson, Haller ended up at Leeds. In the top flight. Gerrard went to Everton. You sort of go through that list, and there's a real core of players there. Craig Fleming, another one, ended up at Norwich. Warhurst. It really speaks to the quality of those players that had been assembled, and then sort of as we've alluded to there, sort of on the sort of counter side of that, the sort of the slightly sort of latter day signings that all cost sort of hundreds of thousands of pounds, but basically Oldham turned out to be either the last stopping point on their career for people like Graham Sharp, or for whom it was like a bit of a downward trajectory after sort of relegation with Oldham. So if I had to go for one, it would be Andy Ritchie. I do feel guilty that I haven't mentioned, as I say, Roger Palmer until now, club record scorer. That in truth, a lot of his goals and his real impact predates my my following of the team. So it was almost a bit of a mythical figure for me. Certainly once we're in the Premier League, his game time was pretty slim, but he had that aura about him, and still did chip in with the occasional goal, but definitely worth a mention.
Upon relegation, was it clear that Joe Royal was just too big to stay at Oldham?
I'm not sure about too big, but it felt like we'd sort of come to the end of a cycle. He'd been there 12 years at that point. That was a long time, even by those standards. I think he was probably one of the longest serving managers around. He'd had opportunities. It seems to have gone to Man City, I believe, in the very late 80s, early 90s, and had stayed with Oldham. He'd been linked with the England job when Graham Taylor got it in 1990 after the World Cup. So he was obviously a manager held in enormously high regard. So I think it was probably inevitable that that would happen. And when the Everton opportunity came up, I don't think anybody begrudged him that. He had stayed at a time when he could have gone. I think he had taken the club, to a sort of high point in like recent history. Certainly, it hadn't quite sustained in the way that he or the club had hoped. So I think he'd reached the point where it was sort of mutually acceptable for to part ways, and both parties could sort of wish each other all the best.
Yeah, I'd echo that. He had been very loyal in the past. Again, I think that's unthinkable now that a manager would turn down those jobs. He certainly turned down Manchester City, but Everton was his club. Really, it was his boyhood club. It was where he'd made his name as a player. So yeah, it did feel inevitable, and as you say, the end of a cycle. And yeah, I certainly don't want to sound critical. I mean, he did fall out with certain players and didn't always spend the bigger money too well, but absolutely gave the fans their best memories to this day, and built more than one team that was outstanding to watch and capable of competing with the best teams. Again, in retrospect, it would have been, I think had he stayed, he would have done a better job than the people that followed him. That's for sure. But at the time, it did feel like it was maybe just right for both parties that he move on.
Can you summarize the slow descent of Oldham Athletic since this reference year of 1994 and their status today?
Only if we have to.
Like the slow sinking of a ship at sea is, you could see it happening, but nothing could be done about it. Yeah, I mean, we lasted what, 3 years at Championship level. We ended up, I think Graham Sharp was in charge for 2.5 years of that, and Neil Warnock came. I think Oldham Athletic is the only club that Neil Warnock has been at and like not achieved any kind of success. And I don't know. I don't really sort of believe in fate and karma, but it almost feels like the period since then a sort of payback for all those like high spirited times where we overachieved. We've had a sort of a long payback on that. So yeah, we sunk into the third tier, stayed there for 21 years. I've always meant to try and work out sort of mathematically, whether it was sort of more likely that we would have been promoted or relegated at least once in those 21 years than finished in that sort of middle zone so consistently. We had a couple of flirtations with the playoffs in that time. There were a few seasons when we were quite well financed by an owner who turns out wasn't the best, for the sort of long term interests of the club. We had John Sheridan in charge. He was the man who'd given away that penalty in 1990 that had allowed Neil Redfern to score and win the championship. So there was a certain sort of like poetry to that, and he was a real fan's favourite. But yeah, I mean, basically poor management and of the club, poor stewardship, under investment. And I sort of think that football changed. I don't know. Oldham were badly managed. There's no two ways about it. But so Oldham was sort of sinking at a time when the rest of football seemed to be in the ascendancy. Spending ever more money and doing things more innovatively and better in lots of clubs' cases. So we were basically just going against the traffic there and sort of sliding down the league. So yeah. It's probably best not to go into the last few seasons, which have been a bit of a nightmare. But there is there's a sort of ray of sunshine on the horizon now with a new local owner in charge, and the club actually starting to do things in the right way again, in that they just haven't done for probably a decade or two. Small gestures like when important players leave the club, actually recognizing that and noticing and paying tribute to the efforts and endeavors of those players and the impact that they've had. We just weren't doing simple stuff like that, and it comes to something when you can't even hold on to your ticket office staff, let alone your star players. So that was just a sort of a symbol really of how badly run the club was. But yeah, things are on the up now. Pleased to say.
Yeah, I think that's really a perfect summary. That football's changed just at the wrong time for Oldham in many respects, but yeah, there's been bad management, bad ownership, bad transfers, instability. When you think that Royal and Frizzell before him, that was two managers in 20 plus years. They were actually a byword for stability and doing things the right way. And since then, there's just been a huge turnover of managers and, of course, players. And that it's just not possible to build a team in the way that Joe Royal did. That players aren't going to join Oldham from Everton or Leeds or Manchester City. That's just an era that's long gone. And they've never been a big club, Oldham. They've always had fairly small crowds and been in the shadow of the Manchester clubs, as we said right at the start. And short of finding a very rich owner or a manager who can more or less work miracles, who probably wouldn't stay around very long, we're talking about the last period when it was really possible for a smaller club to achieve what they did and really overachieve on a fairly limited budget. It's just not something that we will see in that way again. But we needn't dwell too long on the decline and hope that they've bottomed out in the National League this year.
In closing, how do you both look back at these few seasons when Oldham Athletic was with the elite?
Yeah, I think we both reflected on, if I knew then what I knew now, how would you sort of, how much more would you sort of absorb and appreciate that? I mean, it felt a bit like a fairy tale then, but it certainly does now, with the benefit of 25 years worth of hindsight. So I mean, for me, it's you can often sort of age people when you talk to them about football. You explain you're an Oldham Athletic fan, and if they they'll either immediately get it and they'll think of Andy Ritchie and Rick Holden and the like, and they'll be they'll be quite quite animated and excited about that, and they'll sort of like stir up some memories, or they'll just look at you blankly, if they were sort of born after that period. When I get new graduates arrive at work and talk about football, they don't really know who or what Oldham Athletic is, or why anyone would support them, particularly when they didn't hail from that town. So it's it's a period that put the club on the map. I think we still trade on that a little bit. I think when games were chosen for to be televised, even in sort of League One, League Two levels, there was always that sort of cachet about it being Oldham Athletic and the glory days of the 1990s. But that the sort of half life of that is sort of burning on, and that's becoming a bit more of a distant memory. So it's time to start making some new memories. As Paul said, I think it's unrealistic to think that Oldham will be back in the Premier League any day soon, or indeed ever. But I think you've got to enjoy it for what it was.
Yeah, I just feel very fortunate to have lived through those seasons. I mean, really, when I started going, I had no idea, obviously, that this club that had never really achieved anything would be competing with and beating all the top teams in the country. I was quite happy watching them play Grimsby or those kind of teams in front of a couple of thousand. That was enough for me. It certainly wasn't going to be for reasons of bragging in the school playground about your team, and it was just totally unexpected but incredibly exciting time that unfortunately younger fans aren't going to get to see that. I think football's changed too much for that to return in that way. And as Tom says, I admire and feel slightly sorry for anyone that's taken Oldham Athletic up in the last 25 to 30 years, because there hasn't been much to cheer. So you can only trade on those memories for so long, I think. So hopefully things will improve.
I've managed to rope my son into becoming an Oldham Athletic fan. So he's 9, and he's very much the only Oldham Athletic supporter apart from me who lives in our hometown. But I tell him about these memories and these experiences, and he finds it quite hard to believe. So I'm gonna have to get that VHS tape out and show him. But it's a different experience these days being an Oldham Athletic supporter, that's for sure.
With that, I would like to thank Mr. Griffiths for your participation in this interview. As always, feel free to leave questions and comments. You may contact me on my blog, on Facebook under Soccer Nostalgia. On Twitter, I'm at SP1873. Mr. Paul Whittle can be contacted on Twitter at 1888letter, and his blog is the 1888 letter. You may also follow the podcast on Spotify, Google, Apple, and Stitcher podcasts, all under Soccer Nostalgia Talk Podcast. Please leave a review, rate, and subscribe if you like the podcast. And Mr. Griffiths' various links and contact informations have also been included, as well as the link to our previous interview from back in March regarding your site, Calcio England. And all this information is listed on the blog and podcast uploads. So, Tom, thank you once more, and hope to continue the discussions on football history.
Great stuff. Thanks, Sean. Nice to speak to you too, Paul.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, great to relive these memories.
Thank you.